The moment Matthew Merritt rode into Caldwell, Kansas, on the morning of April 14th, 1882, with a bullet hole in his coat sleeve and nothing but a half-empty canteen and 11 years of silence behind him, he had no intention of staying longer than it took to water his horse. He had not planned on the general store being run by a woman with flour on her hands and a voice like a creek in springtime. He had not planned on a great many things. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, a cattle town still breathing with the dust of longhorn herds and the boot heels of men who came and went like seasonal winds. It was not a gentle place. The streets were packed dirt-baked hard as iron in the April sun, lined with saloons and a hardware store and a small clapboard church that leaned slightly westward as if tired of standing upright. Cattle buyers moved through in a steady parade, and drovers came in from Texas with their wages burning holes in their pockets. The marshal, a thick-necked man named Denton Briggs, kept the peace with a combination of authority and selective blindness that the town found tolerable. Matthew had ridden through towns like this 100 times. He knew their rhythms the way he knew the sound of his own breathing in a dark room. He knew which saloons served watered whiskey and which ones served the real thing. He knew how to sleep light in a boarding house and ride out before the other boarders were awake. He knew, most importantly, how not to stay. He tied his horse, a dark bay gelding named Rounder, to the post outside the general store and pushed through the door. The smell hit him first: coffee and dried herbs and something sweet, maybe molasses. The store was not large, but it was ordered with a precision that suggested someone who understood both commerce and comfort. Bolts of calico stood upright against one wall. Glass jars of hard candy lined the counter beside scales and a brass register. Canned goods from back east, dried beans and salt pork in barrels of flour. A small cast iron stove in the corner pushed warmth into the room against the morning chill. The woman behind the counter did not look up immediately. She was writing something in a ledger, her dark hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck, a single strand fallen across her cheek. She wore a plain blue dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and there was, as he had noticed from outside through the window, flour on her right hand. "Be with you in a moment," she said, not unkindly, just practical. The voice of a woman who ran things and knew it. Matthew took off his hat and held it in front of him. He did not know why he did that. He could not remember the last time he had taken his hat off inside a building without being asked. She finished her line in the ledger and looked up. Ruth Holloway had what Matthew's grandmother might have called a direct face. Brown eyes that went straight to the point of a thing without meandering. A generous mouth that looked like it had laughed often and cried some, and was mostly at peace with the world. She was 26 years old, though he did not know that yet, and she had been running her late father's general store for 2 years with the kind of competence that had surprised the town and then stopped surprising them because it simply became the fact of things. "Good morning," she said. "What can I get for you?" "Ammunition," he said. ".44 caliber, and dried beef if you have it, some salt." She was already moving, reaching beneath the counter, pulling open a drawer. She set the box of ammunition down and turned toward the shelf behind her for the beef. Passing through, she asked, "Yes, ma'am." She set the wrapped beef beside the ammunition and reached for the salt. "You come up from Texas." "From the South," he said, which was true in the way that vague things are true. She weighed the salt and wrapped it in paper and set it on the counter beside the rest. She looked at his coat sleeve then. The hole was small, but the edges were dark. "You need a doctor?" she asked. Not alarmed, not accusatory, just the practical voice again. "No," he said, "grazed days ago." She looked at him a moment longer than a shopkeeper needed to. He had the feeling of being read, not unkindly but thoroughly, the way you might read a weather sign on the horizon, trying to determine what kind of day was coming. $3.40, she said. He paid her. He should have left then. He should have picked up his goods and walked back out into the April morning and ridden north or east or anywhere, the way he always did. He had 11 years of practice at leaving, but she was writing something down in her ledger again, the total of his purchase, and she said, without looking up, You have blood on your collar too, left side. He touched his collar. There was blood there, dried brown against the white cotton. There is a pump behind the livery, she said. Clean water. Mrs. Caldwell 2 doors down takes in laundry if you need it. She is not expensive. She was not offering these things out of sentiment. She was simply giving information the way you hand someone a road and say, here, this will get you there faster. It was not kindness meant to be remembered or repaid. It was just the right thing said at the right time. He stood there a moment longer than he should have. Thank you, he said. Sure, she said, and looked up again, and there it was, that brief direct look like a lamp briefly unshuttered. Then she went back to her ledger. Matthew walked out into the morning. He stood on the wooden boardwalk for a moment with his goods under his arm and Rounder patient at the post, and the April wind carrying the smell of cattle and distant rain. He looked north up the road, and then he looked back at the door of the general store, and he told himself the only reasonable thing, which was that he had what he came for and there was no reason to linger. He lingered. He lingered for 3 days, though he dressed it up to himself as practical. Rounder needed rest. The bullet graze on his arm, while not serious, had festered slightly, and he asked the doctor, a tired older man named Perkins, to look at it. The doctor looked at it and gave him a jar of salve and charged him 50 cents and told him not to ride hard for a few days. Matthew stayed at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Aldrich, who served breakfast at 7 and supper at 6 and did not ask questions, which he appreciated. He went back to the general store the next morning because he had forgotten to buy coffee. That was the reason, he told himself, and it was even partly true. He drank terrible coffee at breakfast and thought about the coffee smell in the store and decided he needed his own supply. Ruth was alone again, this time stacking canned goods behind the counter. A boy of about 12 sat on a stool near the stove doing sums on a slate, frowning at the numbers with concentrated effort. Back again, she said, not unfriendly. Coffee, he said. Ground or whole bean? Ground. She scooped it and weighed it. The boy on the stool looked up at Matthew with frank curiosity, the way children do. You the man who got shot? The boy asked. Thomas, Ruth said, not sharply, just with the light firmness of someone who had said a particular name in a particular tone many times before. My brother, she said to Matthew. He is an enthusiastic questioner. I heard the doctor told Mr. Porter about you, Thomas said, unrepentant. Mr. Porter told my sister. Thomas. I am just saying how I heard. Matthew found to his own surprise that he almost smiled. I was not exactly shot, he said. The bullet missed. But it went through your coat, Thomas said. Thomas, go and bring the broom from the back room. Thomas went, looking over his shoulder at Matthew with undimmed interest. He helps me after school, Ruth said, tying the coffee parcel. He means no harm. He is just 12 and interested in everything. It is all right, Matthew said. And again it was true in a way that surprised him. He paid for the coffee. He almost left. He looked at the ledger on the counter, opened to a page dense with figures, and heard himself say, You keep the accounts yourself. She looked up. I do, she said. There was something careful in it, the way you are careful when you are not sure if a question is a compliment or a challenge. I did some bookkeeping, he said. Before, whoever kept these before knew what they were doing. The careful thing softened slightly. My father, she said. He taught me. He was very precise. There was a small pause that held the weight of the past tense. Her father was, not her father is. He passed 2 years ago, she said, and she said it matter-of-factly, the way you say something you have made your peace with even if the peace is not complete. I took over the store. That must have been hard, he said. She looked at him. It was, she said simply. It is also what needed doing. Thomas came back with the broom, and she set him to sweeping between the barrels. And Matthew took his coffee and went out, and he thought about her for the rest of the day in a way that was inconvenient and interesting, and which he tried to attribute to simple human loneliness, and the way a warm store and a direct-faced woman can affect a man who has been riding alone for a very long time. On the second day, he had no particular excuse. He walked past the store twice on his way to and from the livery, and told himself he was just taking in the town. Caldwell had a rhythm to it that he found himself watching with something close to pleasure. Cowboys came in from cattle outfits, brown and trail-worn and loud with the release of arriving somewhere. Merchants did their commerce. Women in sunbonnets moved along the boardwalk with baskets. A group of Osage men rode through on their way south, straight-backed and unhurried, and the town parted around them with the complicated mixture of respect and unease that characterized nearly every such encounter Matthew had witnessed in his years on the trail. The injustice of that unease was not lost on him. He had seen enough of the West to know how much of it had been built on the removal and dismissal of those who had been here first, and the quiet dignity of those Osage riders moved through the street like a counterargument to everything the town believed about itself. On the afternoon of the second day, he was sitting on the boardwalk in front of the boarding house with a cup of Mrs. Aldrich's terrible coffee, when he saw Ruth come out of the store with a crate that was clearly too heavy for her. She was managing it, but just barely, her jaw set and her arms working hard against the weight. He set his cup down and crossed the street. "Here," he said, and he took the crate from her before she could object, which she was clearly gearing up to do. She straightened and looked at him. "I had it," she said. "I know," he said. "Where does it go?" A moment of consideration. Then she pointed to a wagon pulled up beside the store. "Wagon, going to the Miller homestead. Mr. Miller ordered supplies and his wife is not well, so he cannot come in." Matthew loaded the crate into the wagon. Then he looked at the remaining crates just inside the store door. "How many?" he asked. "Two more," she said. He loaded the other two. He straightened and brushed his hands on his trousers, and Ruth was looking at him with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite suspicion, but something between the two. "Thank you," she said. "Sure," he said, and used her word back to her and saw her notice it, a flicker of something in those brown eyes. "Are you staying in Caldwell?" she asked. "Few more days," he said. "Doctor's orders." "The grays?" "Yes." She untied the horse from the post, a steady roan mare that knew its business. "You are not from here," she said, gathering the reins. "That is not an insult. I just mean you do not have the look of someone who is settled." He did not say anything to that. She glanced at him. "I do not mean that as an insult either," she said. "I have just met a lot of men passing through. You can usually tell." "What does it look like?" he asked, genuinely curious. She thought about it with that same practical thoughtfulness she brought to everything. "Like the horizon is always in your eyes," she said, "even when you are looking at something right in front of you." He stood on the boardwalk after she drove the wagon away and thought about that for a long time. On the evening of the second day, there was a small incident at the Lone Star Saloon that spilled out into the street, with the particular energy of men who had been drinking since afternoon and had reached the stage of grievance. Two drovers from a Texas outfit and a local rancher's hand were trying to resolve what was apparently a disagreement about a card game, and it had escalated to the pushing stage when Marshal Briggs arrived from one direction and Matthew, who had been walking back from the livery, arrived from the other. Briggs handled it. He was competent at that kind of work, firm without being provocative, and he had the advantage of being known and recognized. The men separated. One drover had a bloody lip and the rancher's hand had a torn shirt pocket. Matthew watched from the boardwalk. He had no involvement and wanted none, but Ruth came out of the store drawn by the noise, and she stood beside him for a moment watching the last of the altercation dissolve under Briggs's authority. "Does that happen often?" Matthew asked. "Often enough," she said. "Trails end towns. Men come in with wages and frustration, and sometimes that is a bad combination." She paused. "Nobody was seriously hurt. Not this time. Not this time," she agreed. They stood there side by side for a moment in the evening light, the orange sun stretching shadows long across the street, and it was such a simple thing standing next to someone, and yet Matthew felt it as something significant, the way you feel a change in the air before rain arrives. "Where are you going when you leave?" she asked, not nosily, just the way the question arises when you are standing next to someone in the last light of the day. "North," he said. "I have a job, working for an outfit up near Dodge." "Cattle, range work, some horses," she nodded. "Do you like it, the work?" He considered. "It keeps me occupied," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That is not the same as liking it." "No," he said, "it is not." The evening cooled around them. From the saloon came the sound of a piano, someone playing a waltz imperfectly but with feeling. "My father liked music," Ruth said, not quite to him, more to the evening. "He played fiddle on Saturday nights. The whole block could hear it." A pause. "I miss that." "How long has it been?" he asked. 2 years in February," she said. "Heart, it was quick," the doctor said. She was quiet a moment. "I am grateful for that it was quick." Matthew thought of his own dead, the ones he carried. He did not say anything about them. He never did. "You have Thomas," he said instead. She smiled at that, and the smile changed her face entirely, opening it up like a window thrown wide on a summer morning. "I do," she said. "He is a great deal of work, and he is the best thing in my life, which I suppose is how it usually goes with people you love." He thought about that long after he went back to the boarding house. He lay on the narrow bed and listened to Caldwell settle itself into the night, the piano from the saloon winding down, the cattle restless in the pens at the edge of town. And he thought about what she had said about loving difficult things, and he thought about the word home, which he had not said in 11 years. He had not said it in 11 years because there was nowhere to say it about. Home had been a farm in eastern Missouri, a house with a porch that faced a creek, parents who were gone, a war that had come through like a fever and left everything changed, and him without the ability to stay in any place long enough to call it anything. He had drifted west like most men who needed to put distance between themselves and who they had been, and the years had accumulated around him like the rings of a tree, each one adding thickness and distance from the center. He was 32 years old. He had been 32 years old for 2 months and had not marked it in any way. On the third day he helped her. He did not plan it. He came to the store for a reason he did not particularly remember and found her at the back of the store trying to shift a heavy cabinet that needed to be moved for new shelving. She had enlisted Thomas, who was willing but 11 years old and not equal to the task, and together they had managed about 6 inches of movement. Matthew moved the cabinet. It took him 3 minutes. Ruth stood with her hands on her hips and looked at the cabinet in its new position and then at the space where it had been. "I have been trying to do that for a week," she said. "You needed more leverage," he said. "I needed more Matthew," she said, and then something in her face shifted just slightly, like she had surprised herself. She cleared her throat and turned to the shelving materials stacked against the wall. "I can pay you," she said, "if you have time to help put the shelving up." "You do not need to pay me," he said. "I do not take charity," she said. "It is not charity," he said. "Call it occupation. My arm is still healing and I have nothing to do for another 2 days." She considered this. "I will feed you dinner," she said. "Thomas and I eat at noon. It is usually decent." "That is payment enough," he said. The shelving took most of the morning. Thomas assisted with the kind of enthusiastic helpfulness that made everything slightly slower and considerably more entertaining. He asked Matthew a steady stream of questions about cattle drives and trail life, and whether he had ever seen a gunfight, which Ruth intercepted with patient regularity. Matthew answered what he could, which was more than he usually said to people, and he found the questions strange and almost pleasant, like sunlight on a bruise. At noon, Ruth produced a meal from the small kitchen in the back of the store that she also used as an office, a sitting room of sorts, and the occasional sleeping quarters when Thomas stayed with her rather than at their aunt's house 2 streets over. She made beans and salt pork and cornbread and coffee that was vastly better than what Mrs. Aldrich produced, and the 3 of them sat around a small table with the afternoon coming through the single window, and it was the most domestic Matthew had felt in more years than he could properly count. "How did you learn to do carpentry?" Ruth asked, meaning the shelving. "I have done most things at one point or another," he said. "Such as?" He thought: cattle work, horse breaking, carpentry some, a season of mining in Colorado that I do not recommend, driving freight, a year working for a surveying party up in the Dakotas. Thomas's eyes were wide. "Have you been everywhere?" "A considerable amount of places," Matthew said. "But not home," Thomas said with the directness of children who have not yet learned which observations are impolite. Matthew looked at the boy. Ruth looked at Matthew. "Thomas," she said quietly. "I am just curious," Thomas said. Matthew set his fork down. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. "No," he said, "not home for a long while." "Where is home?" Thomas asked. Ruth said, "Thomas, you do not have to answer that," to Matthew at the same time as she said her brother's name again, and there was a careful space in the room. Matthew picked his fork back up. "Missouri," he said, "a long time ago." Thomas, sensitive to the temperature of the room, subsided into his beans. But Ruth glanced at Matthew, and he glanced back, and something passed between them that was not quite said but was thoroughly understood. The language of people who have carried losses and know the shape of it in another person without needing to name the specifics. After dinner, Thomas went back to the front of the store to watch for customers, and Matthew helped Ruth clear the table. It was an automatic thing, the kind of domestic courtesy that rises up in a person regardless of circumstances, and they worked in the small kitchen together in comfortable quiet. "You do not have to tell me," she said, washing the plates. "About Missouri." "I know," he said. He was drying the plates with a cloth she had handed him. The cloth was worn thin in the middle from use. "I was not fishing," she said. "I know that too," he said. She handed him the last plate and he dried it, and she put the coffee pot back on the stove, and she leaned against the shelf and looked at him with those direct brown eyes and said, "Are you all right? I mean that generally, not just the arm." The question was so straightforward and so absent of manipulation that it landed on him with unusual force. Most people either did not ask at all or asked in the way that was really about wanting you to say that you were fine so the conversation could end. She was asking because she actually wanted to know. "I have been better," he said, "and worse." He paused. "Mostly I am occupied, like I said." "That is a careful way of living," she said. "It is a way of living," he said. She nodded slowly. She did not push further, and he was grateful for that, and also, oddly, slightly disappointed, which was interesting to notice in himself. The shelving was finished by the following afternoon. He had the doctor look at his arm, who declared it healing cleanly, and the medical necessity for remaining in Caldwell was gone. He could ride north to Dodge. The job was waiting. He stood outside the boarding house with his bag packed and Rounder saddled, and the morning before him, and he thought about leaving, and he thought about Ruth Holloway's direct eyes, and the way she had said that is a careful way of living, and he thought about 11 years of riding past everything that could have held him. He went to say goodbye. She was alone in the store. Thomas was in school. She was behind the counter writing in her ledger, and she looked up when he came in, and she saw his bag and his hat and his coat, all the signals of departure, and something moved across her face briefly before she arranged it back into its practical composure. "Heading out," she said. "Job's waiting," he said. "Of course." She set her pen down. "I hope the arm holds up." "It will," he said. He stood there. He was holding his hat in front of him again, both hands on the brim, turning it slightly in that nervous way he had not noticed himself doing until now. Ruth looked at him. He looked at her. From the street came the ordinary sounds of Caldwell in the morning, hooves and voices and a wagon somewhere, the world moving through its business with cheerful indifference. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. He did not leave. "Do you need anything before you go?" she said, but she said it with a slight softness that was different from the businesslike tone she used with customers, and he heard the difference clearly. "No," he said. "I came to say goodbye. That is all." She nodded. "Goodbye then, Matthew Merritt." He had not told her his last name, but Caldwell was a small town, and Mrs. Aldrich, who ran the boarding house, was neighborly and information traveled. He almost left. He was almost at the door when she said, "Where are you from?" He stopped. He turned around. She was still at the counter, but she had turned to face him fully, both hands resting on the ledger, and she was asking the question simply and directly the way she did everything, and it was not the same question Thomas had asked at dinner. It was not curiosity about geography. It was the question underneath the question. He looked at her. He thought about Missouri, the creek-facing porch, the parents gone to the cholera and the war and the simple hard mathematics of frontier life. He thought about 11 years. He thought about the word home. He raised his right hand slowly and he pointed at her. Not at the store, not at Caldwell, at her. Directly at her, steady and deliberate, and his eyes did not leave her face. The silence lasted a long moment. Ruth Holloway looked at the hand pointing at her, and then at the man attached to it, and she did not say anything for the space of several heartbeats. He could not quite read her expression, which was unusual because she was a person of generally legible expressions. Then color rose in her cheeks just slightly, and she looked down at the ledger and then back up at him. "That," she said carefully, "is a very significant thing to say without saying anything." "Yes," he said, "I know." Another pause. Outside the store, a dog barked twice and was quiet. "You have a job in Dodge," she said. "I do," he said. "You were going to ride out this morning." "I was," he said. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that was very careful, and also, underneath the careful, something that was waiting, something hoping. "I do not know yet," he said. "I am trying to be honest about that. I have not stayed anywhere in a very long time. I am not sure I remember how." "That is honest," she said. "I know I do not want to ride out of Caldwell and keep riding," he said. "I know that clearly. The rest I am still working out." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The shelving still needs trim work on the ends. I noticed last night." He looked at her. She met his eyes steadily. "I cannot pay you in wages," she said. "I run a tight operation here, but you could sleep in the storeroom if you need somewhere that is not the boarding house and there is food. And the work is real. I have a list of things this store needs that I have been doing alone for 2 years. You are offering me a position," he said. "I am offering you something to do in a place that is not the road," she said. "What you make of that is your own business." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked around the store, the ordered shelves and the brass register and the bolts of calico and the smell of coffee and dried herbs. He looked at the ledger on the counter and the flour still on her right hand from the morning's baking. He looked at Ruth Holloway, who was watching him with those direct brown eyes and giving him the room to think without pressing. "Send word to Dodge," he said. "Tell them the position is filled." The color in her cheeks deepened. "I will write that letter myself if you like," she said. "No," he said. "I will write it. I should own my own decisions." He put his hat back on. He went and tied round her at the post outside. He came back in and she was writing something in her ledger again, but she was smiling just slightly, in the way of someone trying not to smile and not quite succeeding. "The trim," he said. "The trim," she agreed, and handed him a pencil and a measuring tape. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most interesting of Matthew's recent life. He slept the first week in the storeroom on a cot he and Thomas assembled from boards, and a mattress Mrs. Aldrich contributed when she heard he had taken work, because she was that kind of woman. He sent the letter to Dodge and received back a curt reply that suggested his reliability had been found wanting, which did not trouble him as much as it once would have. The work was real, as Ruth had said. The store needed a great deal of attention that had accumulated since her father's death, and that Ruth, managing the commerce and the accounts and Thomas's schooling and the general business of being alive, had not had time to address. There was a rotting board in the back wall. There was a pane of glass in the front window that had a crack running diagonally through it. The storeroom shelves were inadequate and poorly arranged. The roof over the small kitchen had a place where rain got in. Matthew worked through these things methodically and found, to his surprise, that he did not want to be anywhere else. This was a strange sensation. He examined it carefully, the way you examine something you have found in the road and are not sure is valuable or dangerous, and he concluded that it was the combination of the work, which was satisfying, and the company, which was better than any company he had known for a very long time. Ruth moved through her days with a competence and warmth that Matthew found himself watching with something close to wonder. She knew every customer by name and often by the particular needs and difficulties of their lives. She extended credit to families he could see were struggling, and kept those accounts in a separate column in her ledger that he suspected she rarely collected on. She argued cheerfully with the wholesale suppliers and got better prices than they initially offered, and he once overheard her talking down a man who was angry about a damaged shipment until he left calm and satisfied, which was no small piece of work. She was also, when the store was quiet in the evenings, surprisingly funny. She had a dry wit that came out sideways when you were not expecting it, and Thomas was her best audience. The three of them ate supper together most evenings, sometimes in the kitchen behind the store, sometimes at the house 2 streets over where Thomas and their aunt, a severe but fundamentally kind woman named Vera, lived. Vera viewed Matthew with the composed suspicion appropriate to an aunt who has a young woman in her care, and Matthew met her scrutiny with the same directness he had learned from Ruth and was eventually found adequate, if not yet excellent. He liked Thomas enormously. The boy was bright and curious and enthusiastic about everything, and he had attached himself to Matthew with the particular fervor of a boy who had grown up without a father, and recognized something in Matthew that was useful and wanted. Matthew was careful with that recognition. He did not want to promise something he could not deliver. But Thomas's company was good and honest, and it made him feel, at unexpected moments, like someone who was part of something. On the 4th Sunday in April, Ruth closed the store early because Sundays were for that, and she put on her best dress, which was dark green with a lace collar that her mother had made before she died when Thomas was 3, and she and Matthew walked to church. They did not discuss it as a deliberate thing. It was simply that she was walking to church, and he fell into step beside her, and the town of Caldwell observed this with interest and some approval, and Mrs. Aldrich with definite satisfaction. Walking back, Thomas running ahead with the 2 Sullivan boys from the next block, Ruth said, "You have been here 3 weeks." 22 days, he said. She glanced at him. "You have been counting." "Not intentionally," he said. "I just noticed things." The morning was warm, the first real warmth of spring, and the cottonwoods along the street were putting out their pale green leaves. There was a meadowlark somewhere, filling the morning with its specific and insistent music. "Are you planning to stay?" she asked, just like that, plain and direct. He was quiet for a moment. "I think so," he said. "I am still getting used to the idea. Of staying. Of wanting to," he said. She was quiet too for a moment. "I need to be careful with Thomas," she said. "He has already become very attached to you. If you leave, it will affect him." "I understand," he said. "I'm not saying it to make you feel obligated," she said. "I am saying it because it is true and you should know it." "I know," he said. "I'm not staying out of obligation." She looked at him. He looked at her. They had been looking at each other like this for 3 weeks, a constant near conversation conducted entirely in glances, and today something was different about it, the warmth of the morning or the church or the meadowlark or simply the accumulation of 22 days. "Would you like to come to dinner tonight?" she said. "At the house. Vera makes good pot roast on Sundays. She has been told about you, and she has apparently decided to evaluate you properly." "I have already met Vera," he said. "Meeting her and being evaluated by her are different experiences," Ruth said. "I will bring something," he said. "What does she like?" "Humility," Ruth said, "and peppermint candy." He bought peppermint candy at the store that afternoon, which made Ruth laugh, and he brought it that evening to Vera's house and presented it with genuine seriousness, and Vera received it with the expression of a woman who was still deciding, but had moved from suspicious to considering. The pot roast was excellent. The evening was warm enough to sit on the porch afterward, all 4 of them, with the spring dark coming down soft and the stars sharp above the Kansas plain. Thomas fell asleep in his chair with the abruptness of children, and Vera took him inside, and Matthew and Ruth sat on the porch steps in the dark. "She is warming to you," Ruth said quietly. "That is generous," he said. "For Vera it is practically an embrace," she said. He laughed. It came out of him easily, and he realized with a mild jolt that he had been laughing more in the past 3 weeks than he could remember in a long time. There was something specific about laughing beside Ruth. The way her own laugh came out before the joke was quite finished, because she arrived at the point of things quickly. And then the brief moment of shared recognition. "Tell me about Missouri," she said, and her voice was gentle. He was quiet for a moment. The evening held the silence without pressure. "Farm," he said. "About 30 miles east of Jefferson City, creek in the back, good land for corn. My father worked it his whole life." "And your mother?" "Cholera," he said. "I was 14. My father after the war. There was nothing to go back to." She did not say she was sorry in the way that closes a door. She said it in the way that holds it open, and then she was quiet and let him continue if he wanted to. "I was in the war," he said. "Not a thing I discuss much. I was 19 and foolish, and afterward I was neither young nor foolish, and there was a lot of country between me and Missouri, and I kept moving through it." 11 years, she said softly. He looked at her. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas asked me afterward," she said. "He said you looked like you had not said home in a long time. He is perceptive. I told him that some people carry hard things and it takes time to put them down. And he said he would not ask you about it anymore," she said. "And he has not." Matthew thought about that, the 12-year-old boy who had looked at him with all that frank curiosity and then quietly, out of care, stepped back from the wound. He felt something move in his chest that he did not have an immediate word for. "He is a good kid," he said. "He is the best of us," she said simply. They sat in the dark for a while. The stars were extraordinary, that Kansas sky that went on forever, clean and lavish and indifferent to human difficulty. "I have been thinking," Ruth said, "about what you did when I asked where you were from." He did not answer. "I have been trying to understand it properly," she said, "so I do not misinterpret it and make something foolish of it." "You will not make something foolish of it," he said. "Still," she said, "tell me." He thought about how to say it. He had not prepared words for this because he had not, when he raised his hand and pointed, been operating from a prepared position. He had been operating from something that came from deeper down. "I have been trying to find somewhere that felt like it fit," he said. "Not a place. I gave up on places mattering for themselves a long time ago. But people. A place feels like a place when the right people are in it." He paused. "When I looked at you, it felt like something I had been looking for had the right shape. That is not articulate, but it is true." Ruth was very still beside him. "I know it is early," he said. "I know I have been here less than a month. I am not asking for anything you do not want to give. I just wanted to answer your question honestly." She turned to look at him. In the dark he could not see her eyes precisely, but he could see the shape of her face and the attention she was bringing to him, that full, direct, unshuttered attention. "I want to be careful," she said. "I have been careful for 2 years. I have run the store and taken care of Thomas and been responsible for everything, and I have been careful because I thought careful was what the situation required." "It probably was," he said. "Probably," she said. "But I am also 26 years old and I live in a cattle town at the end of a trail, and men come through and go, and I have been watching them go for 2 years without minding, and then you came through and I minded." He was quiet. He let her have the space. "That surprised me," she said. "The minding." "Me too," he said. "The staying." She let out a short breath that was almost a laugh and not quite. She looked back at the dark street and they sat there together with all of it between them, unresolved but present, honest and tentative and alive. "Dinner again next Sunday," she said. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "Now go home before Vera comes back and finds us out here in the dark, because she will assume the worst, and she is too old to have her blood pressure disturbed." He stood up and she stood up and they were close, just for a moment in the dark at the top of the porch steps. He could smell the faint cedar of her hair and the spring air moving through it. He did not kiss her. The time was not yet right, and he knew it and she knew it, and the knowing of it together was its own kind of intimacy. He walked back to the store in the dark and let himself into the storeroom and lay on his cot and thought about the word home and found, for the first time in 11 years, that he could say it without it feeling like something that belonged to other people. May came in warm and then hotter, the great Kansas sky turning a deeper blue and the cattle pens filling at the edge of town as the drives came north. The Kishom Trail through Caldwell brought a particular kind of activity in spring and summer, the whole town tightening with the energy of commerce, and the particular tension of men who had driven cattle for weeks arriving with money and intention. Matthew navigated it the way he navigated most things, with quiet attention, and he learned quickly which drovers were simply tired and celebrating, and which ones were looking for trouble. He had developed this skill over years, and it had kept him alive. And now, it kept the store safe on the evenings when he sat on the boardwalk outside with a cup of coffee and watched the street. One evening in mid-May, a drover came into the store drunk and belligerent, wanting credit for supplies that he had not earned, and that Ruth was not about to extend to a man she had never seen before. Matthew came in from the storeroom quietly and stood behind the man without doing anything in particular, and the drover looked at him and reassessed the room and left with minimal drama. Matthew went back to the storeroom. Ruth finished the transaction she had been engaged in with another customer, and when the store was empty she leaned on the counter and said to Matthew, "Thank you. You handled it," he said. "Having you there made it easier," she said. "I am glad to be useful," he said. She looked at him a moment. "Is that what you are, useful?" The question had warmth in it, a gentle pressing against the careful distance they had been maintaining. "Among other things," he said, and she smiled and they left it there. But the things were accumulating. He could feel them building up the way river water builds behind a small dam, not dramatically, steadily, until one morning it is simply too full and must find somewhere to go. The letter came on a Tuesday in the second week of May. It arrived from a lawyer in Jefferson City, Missouri, addressed to Matthew Merritt, care of the general store in Caldwell, Kansas, which meant someone had been looking for him. He sat with the envelope a long time before he opened it. Inside was a short letter from a lawyer named Cassidy, informing him that the Merritt farm had been in litigation since the death of his father's brother, who had occupied it after the war and died without a will, and that after years of various claims the property had been determined to belong to Matthew as the surviving heir. The farm was his if he wanted it. He sat in the storeroom with the letter and thought about the creek and the porch and the cornfield, all of it preserved in him like something in amber, unchanged because he had not been back to see how time had changed it. He brought the letter to Ruth that evening. She read it carefully. She handed it back. She was very still for a moment. "Missouri," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is far," she said. "It is," he said. She was quiet. He could see her working through it, the careful arithmetic of a woman who had things that mattered here, a store, a brother, a life she had built with her own hands. "I'm not going back," he said. She looked up quickly. "I have thought about it all day," he said. "I came west 11 years ago and I have been west ever since, and the farm is a piece of paper. What is in Caldwell is not a piece of paper. You cannot sell your birthright because of," she started. "Because of you," he said. "Say what it is." She was quiet for a moment. "Because of me," she said. "Matthew, we have known each other 6 weeks. "I know," he said. "I am not making the decision in 6 weeks. I am making it in 32 years, which is how long I have known what I want from a life, and most of those years I spent looking at the horizon for it and not finding it, and then I walked into this store for ammunition and dried beef and found it standing behind the counter with flour on her hands." Ruth put her face in her hands for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "You are going to make me cry in my own store," she said. "I will apologize for that," he said, "but not for what I said." She was quiet for a moment. She straightened and smoothed her apron with both hands and composed herself with the practical efficiency she brought to everything, and then she looked at him with something in her face that was not composed at all. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying not to say that because it seemed very fast and possibly foolish, but since you are apparently saying things that are true tonight, that is mine." He crossed the store in 3 steps and she came around the counter, and he put his hands on her face, both of them, and he looked at her and he said, "I love you, Ruth." And then he kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, fully and without reservation, and the store was quiet around them, and outside the May night was full of stars. He wrote to the lawyer in Jefferson City and told him to find a buyer for the farm. He did not need a great deal of thought for it. He told Ruth, and she said only that she hoped it sold for a good price, and he found that he agreed, because the money would be useful and the farm was a memory, and this was what was real. Thomas, when he heard, let out a whoop that brought Vera through from the kitchen, and Vera stood in the doorway and looked at Matthew with her composed, assessing expression and said, "You are staying in Caldwell, then?" And Matthew said yes, and Vera said, "Good. Supper is in 20 minutes. Wash your hands," which was, from Vera, the equivalent of an embrace. The summer of 1882 in Caldwell was hot and alive and full. The store did brisk business as the trail traffic peaked, and Matthew took on a more formal role in its running, without either of them quite discussing it. He handled the heavier deliveries and the maintenance and the occasional difficult customer, and he began, with Ruth's approval, to take over some of the ordering from the wholesale suppliers, because he had a good head for quantities and a growing sense of what the town needed. He kept the books alongside her, their handwriting occupying the same ledger pages, and he thought sometimes about how strange and right it was to be so thoroughly inside something that he had ridden so far and so long to avoid. He asked her to marry him on a Wednesday evening in July, which was not a particularly romantic day of the week, but he had not been planning it for a particular day. They had been sitting on the front steps of the store after closing, watching the evening traffic thin out and the sky go from orange to purple, and he was telling her something about a conversation he had with one of the wholesale suppliers, and he stopped mid-sentence and said, "Marry me." She turned to look at him. "I mean it," he said. "I want to marry you. I want to stay here and run this store with you and be here for Thomas and build something with you that lasts longer than either of us. I want all of it. Would you marry me?" Ruth looked at him for a long moment. The purple was deepening to blue above them, and the first stars were coming out, and from somewhere down the street came the sound of laughter. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." And she leaned over and kissed him with her characteristic efficiency and then pulled back and said, "We should tell Vera before she hears from someone else. She will be deeply offended if she hears it second-hand." They told Vera that night. Vera received the news with a long look at Matthew, and then a long look at Ruth, and then she said, "I will make a cake," which meant she was pleased, and Thomas threw his arms around Matthew's waist, and Matthew held the boy's thin shoulders and felt something expand in his chest that had no name but which he had no interest in naming because the feeling was enough. They were married in September, on a Saturday, in the small clapboard church that leaned westward. The whole town came, which was not entirely a surprise since Ruth had been part of the fabric of Caldwell for 2 years and was liked thoroughly, but the warmth of it still moved Matthew in a way he was not prepared for. He stood at the front of the church in a good jacket he had bought from the tailor 2 streets over, and he watched Ruth walk down the aisle in a cream dress with her dark hair pinned, and a small bunch of late summer wildflowers in her hands, and he thought about 11 years of roads, and the single morning he had ridden into this town looking for ammunition and dried beef, and the arithmetic of it, all those years and all those miles resulting in this moment. Felt like a kind of miracle that he had not previously believed himself eligible for. The preacher, a soft-spoken man named Aldi's, read the words. Matthew said them back clearly and with complete conviction, and Ruth said them looking directly at him with those direct brown eyes that had read him so accurately from the beginning. When it was done and Aldi said what was permitted, Matthew kissed his wife and the church made a sound of general contentment, and Thomas, in the front row, let out a whoop that startled the choir. The wedding supper was at Vera's house, which could not hold everyone, so it spread onto the street in the September warmth, and there was a fiddle player named Hodge who knew a great many songs and was happy to play all of them, and people danced on the packed dirt street as the evening came on, and Matthew danced with his wife and held her close, and she laughed against his shoulder and said his name, and he thought, "Here. This. Home." They moved into the rooms above the store that autumn. There were 2 enough for now, and Matthew spent 3 weeks making them properly livable. New boards in the floor where the old ones had gone soft, proper curtains, a good stove for the winter, a bed frame that did not creak. Ruth made the rooms theirs with the efficient and sure touch she brought to everything. Curtains she sewed herself from the calico in the store, a rag rug from pieces she had been saving, photographs of her parents on the wall above the chest of drawers. He looked at those photographs sometimes. A man with Ruth's directness in his face, and a woman who appeared to have given her daughter that generous mouth. He had come to love them by proxy, those 2 people he had never met, who had raised her so well and left her too soon, and he felt obscurely that he owed them something, and that the best way to pay it was in the care of what they had left. That winter was cold, the Kansas cold that comes in hard and without apology, and they closed the store in the early evenings and sat by the stove, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have settled into each other's company so thoroughly that silence feels full rather than empty. Thomas came for supper 3 times a week and slept on a cot they kept for him in the storeroom, and Vera came occasionally and was fed well and kept her opinion of the curtains to herself, which Ruth told Matthew later was an extraordinary restraint. In December, Ruth told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen behind the store in the morning, before the store was open. She just said it plainly, looking at him across the table with her direct gaze, and he looked back at her and felt the news move through him like warm light through a window. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Very," she said. "A little queasy in the morning. The doctor says that is normal." "You have already seen the doctor." "I wanted to be sure before I told you," she said. "I am very sure." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and she looked down at their joined hands and then back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was not much that words added to it. Thomas was told at supper that evening, and reacted with a complicated mixture of joy and the slight horror of a 12-year-old, contemplating the actual mechanical realities implied by his sister's condition, which Ruth handled with her characteristic practical grace, by telling him to eat his potatoes and stop making that face. The spring came, and with it, the first cattle drives up from Texas, and the store's busy season, and Ruth behind the counter with her increasing middle and her unchanged competence, and customers who had known her 2 years found themselves with the particular warmth of watching something good grow in a familiar place. The summer was hot again, as Kansas summers are. Matthew hired a boy named Henry, 15 and reliable, to help with the heavier work, freeing himself to be more present for Ruth as the August heat bore down, and the baby grew, and she tired more easily, though she would not say so directly, and he had learned to recognize it in the set of her shoulders. On the 15th of August, 1883, a boy was born in the rooms above the general store in Caldwell, Kansas, with the help of the midwife Mrs. Deaver, who had been at a great many such proceedings and conducted this one with brisk competence. Matthew paced the storeroom below for 2 hours, and then heard a sound from above that was not Ruth, and was the best sound he had ever heard. Mrs. Deaver came to the top of the stairs and said the mother was well, and the child was a healthy boy, and he could come up now. Ruth was pale and tired and thoroughly alive, and she was holding a red-faced and emphatic infant with Matthew's dark coloring and her mother's determined mouth. She looked up when he came through the door, and she looked, beneath the exhaustion, incandescently happy. "Come and meet your son," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the boy in his arms, and he held him for the first time, all 7 pounds of his firm and outraged existence, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused intensity of the very new, and Matthew looked back and felt the last piece of something that had been traveling toward its right position for 11 years, settle into place. "What shall we call him?" Ruth asked. "James," Matthew said. He had not thought about it, but the name came with certainty. His father's name, Ruth considered it. "James Merritt," she said. "Yes, that is a good name. strong. Thomas arrived that evening and held his nephew with the cautious wonder of a new uncle and declared him very small and very loud, both of which were accurate, and Vera, who had been informed by a neighbor before Thomas even arrived, came with a pot of soup and a small wool blanket she had made and a fierce look on her face that meant she was deeply moved and had no intention of showing it. Matthew stood in the doorway of the room later that night, with Ruth asleep and James in the cradle beside her, and he thought about his father's name and his father's farm and the creek and the porch, and all the years between then and this. He thought about the road north from Texas, and the particular morning in April of the year before when he had ridden into a cattle town looking for ammunition. He thought about flour on a hand and a direct gaze, and the question "Where are you from?" and the gesture he had made in answer, the thing he had said without saying it, pointing at a woman he had known for 3 days as though she were the fixed point around which the rest of it organized itself. She was. She had been, before he knew it. And now she was asleep with their son beside her, and the Kansas night was deep and full outside, and he was exactly where he was from. James grew the way healthy children grow in good homes, with alarming speed and tremendous appetite, and a personality that sorted itself out over the first months into a combination of his mother's directness and his father's quieter observational quality, which made him both easier to read and harder to manage than either parent fully anticipated. He took his first steps in the front of the store at 10 months between a barrel of flour and the counter, to an audience of 3 customers and his delighted Uncle Thomas, and Ruth wrote it in the ledger because she kept the ledger in the store and that was where it happened, a brief note in the margin. James walked today. First step, 10 months. Matthew saw the note later and felt the particular sweetness of small permanence, a life being recorded in the margins of commerce, ordinary and precious. The store continued to grow. By the summer of 1884, they had hired Henry full-time, and a girl named Clara 1 day a week to help with inventory. The wholesale relationships Matthew had cultivated were producing better prices and a broader range of goods, and Ruth had expanded the dry goods section in a way that had drawn a reliable female clientele who traveled in from the surrounding homesteads. They were not wealthy, but they were solid, and the solidity felt like something Matthew had been hungry for without knowing it, and was only now recognizing as a specific kind of satisfaction. Thomas turned 14, and then 15 with the speed that teenagers achieve, growing several inches and developing opinions about cattle and land that were considered and practical, and which Matthew recognized as the early stages of a man deciding who he intended to be. He talked with Thomas sometimes in the evenings or on Saturdays when the boy came to help at the store. Not lectures, just conversations, the easy exchange of 2 people who respect each other and are working out the world together. One Saturday afternoon in the autumn of 1884, Thomas came to Matthew in the storeroom where he was repairing a harness and said, without preamble, "I want to learn to ride properly, not just to get somewhere. I want to work with horses." Matthew set the harness down. He looked at the boy, who was almost as tall as him now and had his sister's eyes. "Tell me what you mean by that," he said. Thomas talked for 20 minutes about a man named Garrett who ran horses outside of town and took on young men occasionally as hands, and the conversations Thomas had been having with cowboys who came through the store, and a specific interest in horse breaking that he had been thinking about for over a year. Matthew listened to all of it without interruption. Then he said, "Have you talked to your sister?" "Not yet," Thomas said. "I wanted to talk to you first." "Why?" Thomas looked at the floor a moment and then at Matthew. "Because you know about that life," he said, "and you chose this one. I want to know what you think." Matthew thought about it carefully, the weight of it, because it was not a small question, and Thomas deserved a real answer. "I think the life on the road is real and hard, and some men need it, and some men discover they do not," he said. "I rode for 11 years before I was ready to stop. I do not wish I had stopped sooner because I needed those years to arrive at where I am. But I also know what I was running from, and you are not running from anything, which means your choice is purer than mine was." Thomas was quiet. "So you think I should do it?" "I think you should talk to your sister," Matthew said, "and I think you should do what she and you decide together. And I think if you want to work with horses, you should do it while also finishing school because your father would have wanted that and your sister will insist on it." Thomas nodded. "Will you come with me when I talk to her?" "No," Matthew said. "She is your sister. That conversation is yours, but I will be in the next room if you need support." Thomas talked to Ruth. It was a long conversation. Matthew heard portions of it through the wall, and by the end the tone had settled from the initial tension of a protective older sister, hearing something alarming into the measured consideration of a woman who loved her brother, and understood that protecting people sometimes means releasing them. She made conditions, school to be completed, an arrangement with Garrett that she approved of, Sundays reserved for family. Thomas agreed to everything. He shook Matthew's hand afterward with the solemnity of someone who has been taken seriously for the first time in an important matter, and found it equal to his expectations. Ruth came to Matthew that evening and leaned against the door frame of the storeroom where he was reading, with James on her hip working at a piece of bread with focused concentration. "You told him to talk to me," she said. "It was your conversation to have," he said. "You could have helped." "You did not need help," he said. "You needed room." She looked at him for a moment. "You know me very well," she said. "I am paying attention," he said. James threw the bread at Matthew with cheerful accuracy, and Matthew caught it and handed it back, and James reconsidered its merits and ate it. The winter of 1884 brought snow that settled deep over the Kansas plain and kept the town slow and the store quieter than summer's energetic commerce. It was a good quiet. Matthew liked the winter store, the stove running warm and the smell of coffee, and the particular muffled intimacy that snow created outside the windows. He liked their evenings above the store with James asleep and the lamp lit and Ruth reading or mending or going through the accounts, and him doing whatever needed doing, comfortable in each other's company in that way that only grows from time and attention and choosing each other repeatedly. One such evening Ruth looked up from her reading and said, "I have been thinking about the farm." He looked up. "Missouri. It sold," she said. "Last spring. You told me." "It did," he said. "There was money from it," she said. "We have talked about expanding the store." "Yes," he said. "I think we should do it," she said. "Properly. The building next door has been empty since Mrs. Hamilton left. We could buy it and take the wall out." He considered it. He had been thinking the same thing for several months but had been waiting for her to arrive at it independently because it was her store, fundamentally, and that mattered to him. "We can afford it," he said. "Just," she said. "Just is enough," he said. She smiled. "All right then," she said. They bought the building in March of 1885. The expansion took 3 months, Matthew doing much of the work himself with Henry's help, and a local carpenter named Griggs handling the structural elements. The new space allowed for a dry goods section that was genuinely comprehensive, bolts of fabric in quantity, notions and thread and buttons, ready-made clothing that Ruth ordered carefully from Eastern suppliers in sizes that reflected the actual population of Caldwell and its surroundings rather than the idealized measurements of catalog illustrations. The expanded store opened on a Tuesday morning in June of 1885 to what was, for Caldwell, a remarkable crowd. Ruth had put a notice in the weekly paper and word had traveled out to the homesteads, and women came in from miles around to see the new dry goods section and to buy the things that had previously required a trip to Wichita or a long wait on a catalog order. Ruth moved through the store with the ease of a person entirely in her element, knowing exactly where everything was and what every customer needed. And Matthew watched her from behind the counter, where he was handling the register, and felt the same thing he had felt on their wedding day, which was the specific wonder of being present for something extraordinary that is also entirely ordinary and entirely right. In the evening after closing, he stood in the middle of the new expanded store with its orderly shelves and its smell of fabric and cedar and coffee, and Ruth came to stand beside him and they surveyed it together. "Your father would be proud," he said. She was quiet a moment. "I think so," she said. "I hope so." She looked up at the new shelving he had built, straight and sturdy, the trim work clean and even. "I am proud," she said, "of what we have done here." "We," he said, the word warm in his mouth. "We," she agreed. James took to the expanded store with the thoroughness of a 2-year-old who considers all territory his domain, and was regularly retrieved from behind the counter, or from among the bolts of calico, or from the area near the hard candy jars with the frequency that made him a regular source of entertainment for customers and mild exasperation for his parents. He was a communicative child, full of opinions and specific requests, and he had Ruth's way of looking directly at a thing and deciding what it was. Thomas came through Caldwell in the summer of 1885 with a cattle outfit he had spent 6 months with, and he was taller and browned by the sun and quieter in a way that suggested the road had given him something he needed. He stayed a week and spent a great deal of it holding James, who was fascinated by his uncle's spurs and his stories. He and Matthew talked long on the last evening, sitting on the steps of the house, and Thomas said, "You were right about what you said. About needing it and finding out whether you do." "What did you find?" Matthew asked. "That I need it for now," Thomas said, "but not forever." He looked at the dark sky. "I think I want land eventually, my own place." "Horses. Good ambition," Matthew said. "I want what you have," Thomas said simply. "Not the same, my own version, but something solid, something that lasts." Matthew thought about that for a while after Thomas rode out the next morning. He thought about what it meant to be a model for something, to have built something visible enough that a young man could point to it and say, "I want that kind of permanence." He had not thought of himself as that kind of person. He had thought of himself, for 11 years, as the kind of person who rode past permanence with the horizon in his eyes. Ruth had seen something different, or seen something that could become different, and the distance between what he had been and what he was now was exactly the width of her belief in the possibility. He told her this, imperfectly, one evening when James was asleep and the store was quiet and the autumn dark was coming down around Caldwell. She listened with her full attention, which was considerable. "Thomas said he wants what we have," he said. "I heard him," she said. "I think about what that means," he said. "What we built. I rode for 11 years without building a thing that lasted past the next town." "You were learning," she said. "That is a generous way of saying it." "It's also accurate," she said. "You came here with everything you needed. You had just not had anywhere to put it yet." He looked at her in the lamplight, the familiar and beloved line of her profile, the ink on her fingers from the ledger, the strand of dark hair that still fell across her cheek. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he had been saying it for 3 years now, not from the first bright shock of it, but from the deeper place, the well that does not run low. She turned to look at him. "I love you," she said back, the same way. They had been saying it long enough that it had the quality of something spoken into the fabric of things, woven in rather than applied. "I have been thinking," she said, in the tone she used when she had been thinking about something for a while and was now choosing to mention it. "Tell me," he said. "Another baby," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He watched her face, which held the particular quality of someone who has made a decision and is presenting it calmly but feels it deeply. "Yes," he said. She let out a quiet breath. "You are very easy to talk to," she said. "Has anyone ever told you that?" "Not before you," he said. "I find that hard to believe," she said. "People told me I was hard to talk to," he said, quiet, closed. "You were," she said, "when I met you, but you listened. That is the important part. A lot of people talk easily and do not listen at all. You were the reverse." He thought about that. He thought about all the things he had learned from listening to her over 3 years, the specifics of her mind and her humor and her particular way of meeting the world, all of it learned by paying close attention. "You taught me how to talk," he said. "That is not true," she said. "You just needed someone to talk to." Ruth was expecting again by November. The winter was mild that year. which the farmers around Caldwell appreciated, and the store was busy through the cold months in a way that reflected the growing population of the surrounding territory. Caldwell itself was changing, as cattle towns along the trail were changing, beginning the long process of becoming something more settled and less temporary. And the change was visible in the new houses going up at the edge of town, and the school expanding, and a second church established on the south side, Methodist to balance the Baptist. Matthew watched these changes with the particular interest of a man who has seen a great many towns in various stages of becoming, and can recognize a good one finding its permanent shape. He had found his own permanent shape here. He knew that with the certainty that comes from the body of evidence rather than hope. 3 years of evidence, specific and daily, a woman and a child and a town and a store, and the steady building of something that had his hands work in it. The Missouri farm that had once been the only thing called home was a memory, and a sum of money that had become the east wall of an expanded store and the shelving he had built inside it. He had turned one home into another, and the arithmetic seemed right. The baby came in June of 1886 on a warm evening when the store had just closed, and the cattails were blooming at the edge of the small pond east of town that James called the Duck Place. Mrs. Deaver was present again, competent and unhurried, and the birth was easier than the first, which she attributed to second children having a better understanding of the world's geometry. A girl this time, small and dark-haired and possessed from the first hours of a particular composure that made Mrs. Deaver say she had never seen such a calm infant, and which made Matthew think of Ruth's steadiness in the way that children evoke their parents even in their smallest, earliest details. "Clara," Ruth said when he asked. She was holding the baby in the evening light from the window, and she looked at him with those brown eyes that still gave him the feeling of being known. "After my mother." "If you agree." "Clara," he said. He tested the weight of it. "Clara Merritt." He sat on the edge of the bed beside her, the same bed they had been sharing for 3 years, in the rooms above the store that smelled of coffee and cedar and the particular domestic warmth of a life lived fully in one place. He put his arm around Ruth carefully, and she leaned against him, and the baby was between them, small and new and already themselves. James, brought up from Vera's house the following morning where he had spent the night, looked at his sister with the concentrated evaluation of a 3-year-old being asked to accept a significant alteration in the world order, and then said, "She is very small," and then asked for breakfast, and then, over breakfast, asked if she would grow bigger, and then, when told yes, nodded as though this was satisfactory information and ate his eggs with renewed appetite. Thomas came through at the end of summer and held Clara with the careful hands of someone who has learned something from holding James 3 years ago, and he was quieter now, the road having seasoned him into a young man of 20 who was beginning to see the shape of what he wanted with more precision. He told Matthew and Ruth over supper that he had been talking to a man south of Wichita who was selling a small spread, decent grazing, a working barn, 20 horses. "How much?" Matthew asked. Thomas told him. Ruth looked at Matthew and Matthew looked at Ruth. "We can help," Ruth said. Thomas started to refuse. "Thomas," Ruth said in that voice, "you are my brother and I have money and you need some of it, and that is the full conversation." Thomas looked at Matthew, who spread his hands in a gesture that said he was not getting involved in this particular domestic negotiation, and Thomas should surrender gracefully. They gave Thomas the loan with terms that were in writing because Ruth insisted on business being business even in a family, and Thomas signed his name and shook Matthew's hand, and told Ruth he would pay every cent back, and she said she knew he would, and that was why she was not worried about it. Thomas bought the spread. He sent letters, infrequent but warm, through the following seasons, letters full of the specific details of a life being built from its foundations, a broken fence mended, a horse trained to the bit, the first winter survived, a neighboring family met with a daughter Thomas mentioned once and then twice, and then several times in a way that told the whole story. James started school in the fall of 1887 and applied himself to reading with an intensity that gratified his teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Burke, who sent home notes of praise that Ruth read aloud at supper, and then filed in the ledger's margin because that was where she kept what mattered. Clara grew into her composure, a serene and watching child who assessed the world from her mother's hip with large dark eyes, and then, as she found her feet, from her own 2 legs, moving through the store with the confidence of someone who knows the territory. She had a particular attachment to the candy jars that required management, and a particular attachment to her father that required nothing but his presence, which he gave gladly every day. In the spring of 1888, they planted a kitchen garden behind the store, a project Ruth had been considering for years. Matthew built the beds from new lumber and turned the soil, and Ruth planted tomatoes and beans and herbs, and a row of sunflowers along the south fence that were strictly Ruth's decision, and which she defended against any suggestion of impracticality with cheerful firmness. "Sunflowers are not practical," Matthew said, in the pleasant ongoing conversation they had been having about this for 3 weeks. "They are good for the soul," Ruth said, pressing seeds into the earth with her thumb. "Which is practical if you think of the soul as a working part of the system." He thought about that. "I cannot argue with that," he said. "I know," she said. "I designed the argument carefully." He laughed. She looked up at him with the sunlight on her face and 4 years of marriage in her eyes and the fresh soil on her hands, and he thought, as he thought with a regularity that had never diminished, about the morning he had ridden into Caldwell and tied round her to the post and pushed through the door looking for ammunition and found something he had not known he was looking for. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "April 1882, he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. A slow smile came up her face. "You rode in looking very much like a man who was about to leave," she said. "I was," he said. "What stopped you?" "You had flour on your hand," he said, "and you said sure. And you looked at me like you could read the weather in my face." She laughed, that full laugh that still arrived before the joke was finished. "That is a very romantic reason to change your life," she said. "It was not just that," he said. "I know," she said. She looked at him steadily, the direct look he had loved from the first day, the one that went straight to the point of a thing. "It was 11 years of road and 1 day of store, and you are not a foolish man, Matthew Merritt. When you know something, you know it." "I knew it when you asked where I was from," he said. She was quiet for a moment, remembering it. "You pointed at me," she said. "You were from," he said, past tense. "You already were." She stood up and came to him, brushing the soil from her hands, and she took his face in both palms the way he had once taken hers. In the store the evening he had told her he loved her, and she looked at him with everything she was. "You are from here," she said. "You are from us. You are from everything we have built and everything we will build." "Yes," he said, simply and with his whole heart. She kissed him in the spring morning with the seed beds around them and the sunflower seeds just under the soil and the store behind them and their children inside it, and the long road that had ended here, in this yard, in this woman's hands. The sunflowers grew that summer to a height that required no defense whatsoever because they were magnificent, tall and gold-faced and insistent, lining the south fence of the kitchen garden with the confident beauty of something that knows exactly what it is. Ruth cut some of them and put them in a jar on the store counter. Customers mentioned them. Several women asked about the seeds, and Ruth sold packets of them by September, which made Matthew laugh and allowed Ruth to say, with complete justice, that the sunflowers had been practical after all. Thomas married his neighbor's daughter, a woman named Evelyn, who wrote a clear and warm letter to Ruth that Ruth answered with equal warmth, and then read to Matthew in the evening. They went south to the wedding, all 4 of them, Matthew and Ruth and James and Clara, in a wagon that took 3 days on good roads, and Thomas stood at the front of a small church on the southern Kansas plain and married Evelyn with the steady happiness of a young man who has worked for something good and found it. And Matthew stood beside him as a witness, and felt the deep completeness of watching Thomas arrive at his own version of what the Merritt store represented. On the way home, James asleep with his head in Ruth's lap and Clara asleep against Matthew's side, Ruth said quietly, "Do you know what I was thinking in the church?" "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about my father," she said. "How much he would have loved this. Thomas married, you beside him, the store doing well, James and Clara." She was quiet a moment. "I talk to him sometimes, not out loud, just in my thoughts. I tell him things." "What do you tell him?" "That the store is good," she said. "That Thomas is good, that I am happy." She looked at Matthew in the wagon dusk. "That you came." He reached across the sleeping child between them and took her hand and held it, and did not let go the rest of the way home. The wagon moving through the Kansas dark, the stars overhead, Caldwell drawing nearer with every mile. They had a third child in the winter of 1889, a boy they named Daniel, who arrived noisy and opinionated, and immediately established himself as the loudest member of the household, which given the competition from James and Clara was an achievement. Mrs. Deaver delivered him, and pronounced him the most emphatic infant she had attended in 30 years of midwifery, which Ruth accepted as a compliment, and Matthew accepted as a warning. Daniel was in many ways the synthesis of his parents, Ruth's directness and Matthew's observational quality combining in a child who saw everything, and then commented on it at volume. He made his siblings laugh and his parents work, and the store customers charmed from the time he could stand on the candy jar's shelf and survey the room with imperial confidence. James at 7 was already showing the head for figures that Ruth recognized as her own inheritance, keeping a careful tally of the store's candy inventory in his head, with a precision that Matthew suggested might be put to better purposes and James said were perfectly good purposes as they stood. Clara at 3 was the store's particular favorite, received like a small dignitary by regular customers who brought her bits of ribbon and hard candy and small things, because her composed, brown-eyed assessment of the world was impossible not to love. The store continued to be the center of what they were. Matthew had been its co-proprietor in all but formal name for years, and in 1890 they changed the sign above the door from Holloway General Store, which it had been since Ruth's father had made it, to Merritt General Store, which they discussed for 2 evenings and decided together without any particular friction, because both of them understood it was the accurate name for what the store had become. Ruth cried a little, privately, at the change. Matthew found her in the store one evening after closing, standing at the window looking up at the new sign in the last light. He stood beside her. "It still feels like his," she said. "It is," Matthew said. "Everything you built from it is his." "The sign just says who runs it now." She leaned against him. "I wish he had met you," she said. "I think he would have made me work for it," Matthew said. She laughed. "He absolutely would have," she said. "He would have made you prove yourself for a year before he said a kind word." "I would have," Matthew said. "He would have been right, too." She turned and put her face against his chest, and he held her there in the store that smelled of coffee and cedar and everything they had built. And she was quiet for a while, not sad exactly, more in the way of acknowledging something fully and then being at peace with it. By 1891, Caldwell was changing further, the wild years of the cattle trail giving way to something steadier and more domestic. The Kishom Trail's era was winding down as the railroads expanded and the open range diminished, and the town that had been defined by its position at the trail's end was redefining itself as an agricultural community, a county seat, a real town rather than a seasonal hub. Matthew watched the change with the perspective of a man who had known the trail's wild years and understood what was being gained and lost in the exchange. The store adapted. Ruth adapted it with her usual precision, tracking what the new Caldwell needed rather than what the old one had needed, expanding the agricultural supply section for the homesteaders whose dry goods requirements were now the primary trade. Matthew handled the outdoor goods and the equipment, knowing from his years of ranch work what a working man needed, and how to stock for it without overextending. Thomas visited in the spring of 1891 with Evelyn and their daughter, a small, fierce-eyed girl named May who was 18 months old and immediately attached herself to James, who was 9 and patient with her in the way of older children who are secretly charmed. Thomas paid back the last of the loan in that visit in cash, with the air of a man who has been waiting to do this for a specific reason, and found the occasion satisfying. Ruth put the money in the register and gave him a receipt, and then stepped around the counter and held her brother for a long time without saying anything. Thomas and Evelyn stayed a week. They talked about expanding the horse operation, which Matthew thought was sound, and about the land they might add in a year or two, and about May's apparent belief that she was the rightful owner of all food within a 10-foot radius. Evelyn was warm and funny and treated Ruth with the particular consideration of a woman who has heard about her husband's sister all her life and is satisfied to find the reality equal to the story. On the last evening, Thomas said to Matthew, alone on the steps while the women talked inside, "You saved my life, you know." Matthew looked at him. "No," he said. "Not literally," Thomas said, "but you showed me what a man can make. My father was gone when I was little. I did not have an example. And then you were there and you were real, and I could see how it was done." Matthew sat with that for a moment. He thought about the boy on the stool doing sums, the boy who had asked too many questions and whose sister had sent him for the broom, the boy who had fallen asleep at the supper table and then asked with 12-year-old frankness whether Matthew had found home yet. "You knew before I did," Matthew said. Thomas looked at him. "What do you mean?" "At dinner," Matthew said. "You were 12 years old and you said I had not been home in a long time, before I said it, before I understood it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I just looked at you," he said. "You looked like someone who was tired of moving." "I was," Matthew said. "But you could not stop on your own," Thomas said. "You needed Ruth." "Most of the best things that have happened to me," Matthew said, "required your sister." Thomas grinned, the same grin as the 12-year-old on the stool. "She is like that," he said. The September of 1891 brought an early cold that rattled the windows of the store and made Ruth declare the winter was going to be hard, which proved correct. But they were prepared, the storeroom well stocked, and the stove in the living quarters sound, and the children settled in their routines. James at school and Clara at 5 beginning her own education, and Daniel at 2, a constant cheerful occupant of his mother's hip and the store counter and every surface he could climb. One November evening, with the first snow coming down outside the windows and the lamp warm in the store and Ruth doing the accounts while Matthew read and Daniel slept and James and Clara were put to bed, Ruth looked up from the ledger and said, "Do you know what year it is?" He looked up from his book. "November 1891, he said. 9 years from April 1882, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "We have been here 9 years, she said. "Together, this store, this family." He put the book down. He looked at her across the room, at the woman who had looked at him with direct eyes across a counter the morning he had stopped to buy ammunition and found a home. "9 years, he said. "Are you glad you stayed?" she asked. It was not an anxious question. She knew the answer. She asked it because some things are worth saying out loud, worth naming in the November dark while the snow comes down outside. He got up from his chair and crossed the room and sat beside her at the table and took the pen from her hand and set it down. He took her hand in both of his and he held it and he looked at her. "I rode 11 years looking for something I could not name," he said. "And then I found it in a store in a cattle town in April, standing behind a counter with flour on her hands, and I have been glad every single day since." Ruth's eyes were bright. "Every single day," she said. "Every single day," he said, "including the day Daniel ate the entire jar of peppermint candy and we spent the evening as a direct consequence." She laughed, the full laugh, and he was still holding her hands and the snow was still coming down outside and the children were asleep and the lamp was burning and the store was quiet around them. "I love you," she said, "Matthew Merritt." "I love you," he said, "Ruth Merritt." Outside, the Kansas snow came down white and deliberate, settling over Caldwell the way good things settle, without announcement, with permanence. The sign above the door was covered with it by morning, the letters softened but still there, still readable to anyone who looked. Merritt General Store. The name of a home built from a hand raised in answer, from a word a man had not said in 11 years until the day he said it with his whole life. He said it every day after that. He said it in the ordinary morning ways, in the opening of a store and the making of coffee and the voices of children. He said it in the accounts and the ledger and the sign above the door. He said it in the way Ruth looked at him across a room full of everything they had made together. He said it in the way his children said it when they came running, the easy, unthinking confidence of people who had always had it. Home, such a small word, such an enormous thing.